Welcome to the Ron Johnson Discipleship Podcast.
Here we go again, another deep dive into biblical worldview and why ideas have consequences and bad ideas have really bad consequences and good ideas actually lead to the world in which we find ourselves in today. And I cannot think of a topic that is more apropos to discussion than this topic of science, because, you know, we are living in such an American culture, Western culture, that worship science, right? I mean, science is everything, technology, and we look at Christians as being like in the dark ages and obsolete and stupid and all of these things. And yet, you know, as our topic has been in this book, the book that made your world, the basic premise has been, wait a minute, we have to go back and look at the presuppositions. We have to go back and look at the ideas and the cultural things that gave rise. I kind of look at it like the soil. You know, you if the soil's not good, you can have great seed, you can have a good idea, but nothing's going to be established, nothing's going to grow. And so we get back today to kind of rewinding the tape and saying, wait, time out, all you anti-Christian, let's worship science, follow the science people. We've slammed the brakes on today, and we say, wait a minute, where'd science come from?
Well, it's interesting because science, like you said, has become basically the counterfeit savior, of a messiah of our popular culture's religion, basically, right now. And the problem is science, as we discover, science in itself is not a sustainable, it cannot be a savior unto its own. So basically, when you undercut biblical worldview from its roots, eventually science is going to morph back into mysticism and superstition, which is kind of happening right now in our culture today, right?
Absolutely.
Debating what is science. So it's happening before our very eyes. But when you study this book, you start to look back at the foundation for what started science, which is the biblical worldview. Then you realize, if you lose biblical worldview, you're going to quickly lose science.
Yes, and you're exactly right. And then science is not neutral, because science requires a scientist to interpret the data. And the problem is every scientist has a worldview, and every scientist is fundamentally religious because that worldview dictates how you look at the facts. And so we're going to get back today, peel the layers off. You know, we're going to expose the straw man argument that somehow, haven't you heard this one? Science and Christianity are in conflict.
Yeah, religion and science.
Either you're going to be scientific and smart and follow the facts, or you're going to be some superstitious religious moron that deserves an age long ago that we moved on from. And that is just so untrue. We're going to find that again. Most of the science and the scientists that gave us the world in which we live were deeply devoted Christians and deeply devoted to the scriptures. But before we even get into that, I think it's interesting. You know, he starts off in this book by saying where he grew up, and it was like 50 miles, northwest or something of an area in India that was known for diamonds and a diamond mine. He made a comment, though. He said they didn't look for diamonds where he was from because nobody had ever found them in that district. And then he makes an interesting observation that we both loved. People only toil for treasure if they believe that such labor might lead to rich rewards. Mm-hmm. He said, faith makes a difference. The key word there, they'll only toil for treasures if they believe. So you've got to have faith, and there must be a faith in the possibility of science. And so talk about that. You know, if you don't believe there's diamonds in the soil, you're not going to start digging or excavating. Right. But if you have a belief that there's a good reason to believe that there are diamonds in the soil, then you'll go through the necessary work to explore, to dig, to research. Right. And he takes that idea and he transfers it over to science.
Yeah, and it's a great analogy because you think about digging for diamonds, not just like a 5-minute endeavor. It's money and resources and dedication. It's a lot of work. Yeah. Well, the same thing for digging for empirical truth, digging for scientific laws, for principle, mathematical formula. They all take a lot of work and energy. So the question is, throughout the history of the world, why is that there was no infrastructure, this faith for science? There's been great observers and great discoverers throughout the history of the world, but never a culture of science until West and Civ come along.
Yeah.
So what caused all of a sudden to establish the faith for people to dig for scientific truth? What happened? That's the question he asked.
Yeah, and it's a great question. And as you said, because people are created in the image and likeness of God, you're going to find brilliant observers in every culture. This is not a cultural issue in terms of
ethnicity or some people
are better than
not,
others or whatever. That's not the point. The point is, as he, I love his coming from his background. Because he's fully immersed in Hinduism. So, he gets it. He gets what the Hindus believe. And he makes a comment, again, that the word Maya in their culture speaks of the world as unreal, it's an illusion, it's a dream. And so he asks a really great question. If you grow up in a Hindu culture, as most Indian children, they can be very bright when it comes to things like mathematics and applied sciences like that. But when it comes to observing the universe, if you believe that the universe is an illusion, why would you invest your life in trying to discover truths about something that is fundamentally unreal?
Yeah.
That would be completely illogical. Nobody would spend their life chasing after something that was unreal or an illusion, a mirage.
Yeah.
And he says that's the problem with most Eastern religion, is because their worldview does not create the soil with the presuppositions that are necessary even to explore the universe. Because if the universe is full of all kinds of little deities, if it's a mystical place, if it's a place where little gods and little demons, are capricious, there's no rhyme or reason in how they behave, then why would you put any confidence whatsoever in spending 1 millisecond in studying that world? Because there's nothing to be gained there.
You think about, honing, discovering, exploring the concept of gravity, attraction between matters, right? That there's gravity on Earth and and what's the acceleration of gravity. That all takes a lot of work. But if your worldview, if your infrastructure to your belief is that attraction or forces are just affected by the spirit of this lake and the spirit of this tree.
Animism, mysticism, yeah.
Absolutely. There is no discipline, there's no rigor, there's no investment into those measurements, because they could change any second. So once you finally work so hard and measure it, and this God just says, you know what, I'm going to change this thing, and boom. There's no way someone's going to do that, right?
And he said, you go back to the scriptures, for instance, Psalm 19, the heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament shows his handiwork. If the heavens have something to say about the greatness of God, then we need to know who this God is. We need to understand his character, and then we need to look at what this God has done, his created realm. And so he brings up something I was preaching on Sunday. If you're at Living Stones, we were talking about Genesis chapter 1, 26 through 27, the dominion mandate. God created man and woman in his image and likeness, and then he gave us dominion. He gave us the challenge to rule and reign over creation. And that ruling and reigning and taking dominion suggests that we are exploring the created world, and that we are actually working with the created world to create, to develop, to grow, to understand. And that just one verse of us being created by God and then being placed on a planet to have dominion, that separates the Christian view and Christian worldview from every other religious endeavor. Creations of God made in his image and likeness, and then given dominion to rule and reign as regions on this planet, which means we have the power to reign over nature. Nature is not sacred. We don't worship nature. We rule it. That's a radical concept.
It's like if you feel like your role is that you're dropped in the middle of high school as a freshman, and that's your role, and you're just like scared in the corner hoping no one notices you. And that's what most worldview is of how they view themselves. But the Bible actually says, you're the principal. You are the principal. Here's the key, and this is your school.
Yes.
And take reign and rule of it. That will change your perspective walking to that school, right? Being a freshman versus being the principal of the school.
Absolutely.
Right.
A massive change.
A massive change,
And so you look, and this was not in his chapter on science. It was in another one of his chapters, which I forget. But he gave an example that was a profound picture of the theology in practice. Yeah. He said that in his community, they would worship the river, because the river brought the water, and the water brought the life. And so if you don't know the God who created water and rivers and the planet, and you don't understand, as you said, you're the principal and not just a student, then you worship the river while your people starve to death.
Yep.
But he said when Western missionaries came, they said, look,
Yeah.
this river exists for you.
Yep.
It's created by God, but it exists for you to take dominion over. So all your plants here are drying up and dying. And you have water right next to your field. So why don't you use irrigation technology, and why don't you take dominion over the river and pump the water into the field to grow the crops, so that you're not waiting for rain from heaven. You're taking the water from the river to water your crops, and then you're not going to starve to death. Now you'll not only have enough for your family, but you can feed an entire region.
Absolutely.
But that thought was not ever in the mind of a Hindu, because the Hindu worshiped the river instead of taking dominion over the river. It was the understanding of dominion that came from the Christian worldview, and it revolutionized the West and brought economic prosperity and plenty for everybody. I mean, so this is just that one little radical idea was powerful. And so I want us to look, and you and I can talk about this, kind of a summary of the chapter, but he makes the comment that scientific investigation depends on certain assumptions about the world. So we've got about 6 assumptions we want to unpackage today, and they're really, really powerful, and they're uniquely Christian.
And before we get to the assumptions, you will look at some of these assumptions right now through the modern lens and be like, well, no, duh, of course we feel that way. But you got to understand context. Throughout history, no one has ever made these assumptions.
The history of ideas.
Ideas, yes. The history of the world, civilization, ancient civilizations, no one has these assumptions. That's why they did not advance science and technology like the Western Civ did, or actually after the Reformation did, in the Western Civ, because of that. So don't take these for granted. These are not just like, oh yeah, of course.
Absolutely. This actually creates the worldview soil, which has given science a place to grow and thrive. Like he says in the book, that he quotes people that figured out the exact circumference of Earth. How do you do that? 1,000 years ago. You know, like, how do you do that? Or I remember reading about Galileo before he created the telescope. They were able mathematically, with great precision, to say, you know what? If we could see it, this planet would be right there at that particular part in the sky. Right. With great precision, and it wasn't until the technology caught up with the mathematics that they were actually then able to put a telescope up in the sky and go, yeah, there's that planet, just like they said it would be. Right. So they used mathematics, and they used a crazy understanding of certain disciplines and subjects to determine and to monitor, I guess, the precision that God had placed in the world. But again, these were Christians who believed in an orderly world, not people who believed in a spirit world.
Well, exactly. If you believe those stars were like gods and they're going to just move and go somewhere else, why even spend all the energy measuring and studying that, right?
So here's some powerful ideas, as you said, that are uniquely Christian, which we take for granted, but we shouldn't, because they came from somewhere. All right, the first one, the universe, the physical universe was real. Like real table, real matter, real physical body. Right. But again, that's not what Hindus believe or Buddhists believe, but that's what Christians teach. Right. Hindus and Buddhists are trying to escape this world because it's an illusion.
The real world is a spiritual world, whereas the physical world is just all an illusion.
Fake or less. Yeah. Which leads us to the next point. God made it good. In other words, the physical material world is not evil. Mm-hmm. It's not the Gnostic view that somehow matter is evil and spirit is pure. No, the physical world is good. It was created, and the reason it's good is it was created by a God who is good. Yep. And so it's not an evil, disordered chaos. And I like this conclusion. Material things are to be used for the glory of God and the good of people. So we view, when God says the earth is good, that's his declaration over the creation. Then we believe what he says, and we start saying, wait a minute, okay, if the world is good, it's worthy of our focus, it's worthy of our attention, and it can be developed for the glory of God and for the good of people.
That's why the gospel is not just get saved and wait till you go to heaven. The gospel, the true gospel is the dominion, restoring the dominion mandate to say, hey, the world groans and craves for the sons and daughters of Christ to come and redeem the world, because the world was made good and sin corrupted it, but Christ came to redeem it all, right?
And that's a good point. We live in a world that was created good. Sin has corrupted it, which is why there's toil and why there is suffering. And when we see toil and suffering, our job is to alleviate that.
Yeah.
And so we say, okay, let's discover certain plants or certain medicines or certain behaviors that will help alleviate toil and help alleviate human pain and misery.
Yep.
So we actually take part in the redemption of the planet.
Yep.
Because we are, as you mentioned, we are joint heirs. We are co-heirs with Christ on planet Earth, where we rule and reign for the glory of God.
Yep.
Now, this one's huge, and I kind of alluded to that with the illustration of the river. Third point, we are on a planet that is a garden, not a god. In other words, all this nonsense today about Earth Day and Mother Earth and all of this stuff.
Gaia hypothesis.
Yeah, which is basically we almost treat nature as if nature itself is God, and so we're more concerned with pollution than we are with worshiping the Creator. And again, I'm not against. We should be concerned with pollution for the right reasons, but today we live in a world where nature has been deified. Where all that exists is matter, and all that exists is the planet, and we have to save the planet. And we almost become little mini saviors, right? We're out. That's behind the whole green movement. We're going to save.
Even that,
Mother
there's
Earth.
such contradiction, because you're supposed to save the planet, but the planet is God. So what can it save itself and whatnot? It's so convoluted. Whereas the biblical worldview actually gives. It makes sense in the framework to say, no, we do care for nature, but as stewards of God's kingdom, and we don't worship nature, we worship God. That actually provides a cohesive worldview.
Well, this one's the one that always got me. There is no God. All that exists is matter. And Darwin's theory of evolution explains how everything got here, survival of the fittest. But then we believe in survival of the fittest, but then when the fittest start dying out, and we work with the extinction of certain species, then we have to rush in and rescue the species. But I thought the survival of the fittest meant that the fittest should survive and go on, and the weak should die off, and the species that can't cut it.
Yeah, survival of the fittest, not just for animal, but for humans, kind of contradicts compassion, empathy, and caring for the lost, caring for the poor. So you can't have it both ways,
we
right?
We want our cake and we want to eat it too, right? But it doesn't quite work that way.
Right.
So the whole idea is when the world is no longer an object of worship, it becomes an object of study. And that's huge. You will not study, dissect, break apart, manipulate, take dominion over a planet that you believe is God. And that's why, again, the deification of nature mitigates against the study of nature. So you can't have your cake and eat it too. Yep. It's either a God or it's a garden, and the ideas matter. The fourth one here, this is big. If the planet was created by God, and we know that God is good and orderly and rational, etc. In other words, we know the character of God. Then we can have an orderly world. If the world is chaotic and is not orderly, you can't study something that is disordered. Once again, this flies right in the face of evolution, because evolution says everything has been the process of gazillions of years of random processes. In other words, accidental. These are not processes that are based on order or law, because order and law would have to come from someone orderly and lawful, right? So the problem, again, is you cannot have an orderly world without a rational God. And Christianity provides the fact that this is a created world, and it was created by a rational being.
I think there was a verse in Genesis equaling how God told the ocean to come to certain steps and can't come any further.
Yep.
I forgot where in Genesis.
When God ordered the boundaries of the waters.
Yes. So those who read the Bible literally in Genesis and not see it as just some allegory says, oh, wait, so God has put certain laws in place, and every once in a while he will supersede those laws. But most of the time, he followed he let us follow those orderly laws. So let's take some energy and time and discover what those laws are, because when we discover what those laws are, they reflect the glory of God, such as gravity, such as light, such as other physical laws.
And you brought out a good point that the Bible was not meant to be read allegorically. It was when people started reading the Bible literally. And talking about when God established boundaries. Wait, a boundary, if God established a boundary, that boundary must be a law that can be discovered. And therefore, let's go in and dig deeper, and let's try to find out what did God mean here. And I love this whole idea that humans can think God's thoughts after God. In other words, God made us and made our minds and made human rationality to correspond not only with him, so we could know him, but so that we could know the world in which he's placed us. And I got some great quotes. These are not from our chapter here, but they highlight this whole idea that it takes faith in reason to even believe in reason. In other words, faith precedes reason. And the reason that it takes faith and that we should have faith in reason is because our minds correspond to the mind of God, because we're created in his image. So this is G.K. Chesterton in his book Orthodoxy, which I would recommend everybody become a G.K. Chesterton student. I got my really bad glasses on today, so I'm having to hold them up here. I took the other ones home. Do you ever do that? I got like 19 pairs of these, and they're all by my bedside when I need them. All right. Chesterton said, "It is idle to talk always of the alternative of reason and faith. Reason is itself a matter of faith. It's an act of faith to assert that our thoughts have any relation to reality at all. If you are merely a skeptic, you must sooner or later ask yourself this question: why should anything go right, even observation and deduction? Why should not good logic be considered as misleading as bad logic? They are both movements in the brain of a bewildered ape." So if you believe that you're an evolved ape, a highly advanced ape, then why should what's going on in my brain and all the chemicals and everything that's happening, why should that correspond to reality? Like, what is the connection there? Why should I have any confidence that my brain can interact, my inner brain and ideas can react with the outer world around me? And I love this. This is what Charles Darwin said. And this is a powerful quote by Darwin. He said, "With me, the horrid doubt always arises whether the convictions of man's mind, which have been developed from the mind of the lower animals, are of any value or at all trustworthy." That's a great question. Like, if we've evolved from lower forms of life, why should we have any confidence in the convictions of our mind? Would anyone trust in the convictions of a monkey's mind if there are any convictions in such a mind at all? In other words, so Darwin's going, wow, if we evolved from single-cell amoeba, why should our evolutionary processes confirm any confidence whatsoever that what's going on inside my brain has any validity whatsoever? And so, again, what the Christian would say, well, of course our minds correspond with the outer world. We're made by God, and the world in which we're living in is created by God. Therefore, our rationality with the world and with each other has a connection. But we assume that, and an atheist assumes that. And why should you assume that? You have absolutely no worldview infrastructure for those beliefs to have any rootedness.
Absolutely.
As you said, we've been severed. We just go on acting like this is the world and this is the way things are, and we never stop to go, wait a minute, what are the assumptions there? And where does your worldview provide any validity for those assumptions?
And you're absolutely right, because there's people who are considered probably crazy, but they're delusional. They think they are conforming to the truth, and they lead the whole nations or movement towards it, and millions of people die. And at the end of that, they're like, you know what? I was still right. They're out of touch with reality. So that's what craziness looked like. And humanity had to stop at a point and say, am I conforming to the truth? Am I crazy? Because there are crazy people. There are things that people completely out of touch with reality. But even to have that introspective thought to say, am I crazy? Is this conforming to reality? That's a thought that every person needs to ask ourselves. And what is your worldview that allows you to say, this thought that I have actually conforms to reality?
Yeah, we're dealing with the philosophical branch of epistemology. How do I know that I know anything to be true? It's a great question.
And according to these guys, or Darwin, he makes a compelling point. He's saying if I just evolved from a lizard,
Yeah, exactly.
why should I even take what I'm saying, what I'm thinking right now to make any sense or conform into reality?
It's a great question. And that's Darwin having second thoughts on his own theory, which he should. I mean, that's what science does.
We all should have.
We investigate, we question.
Yeah.
These are good thoughts.
Right.
All right, the fifth point, which I think is really good, follow the law. A rational God must create a lawfully ordered world. When you find a law, you have to ask, where did this law come from? That's why when I teach these concepts to teenagers, mostly seniors, I would say, hey, how many of you have taken a chemistry class? They'd all, of course, raise their hand. Or, you talked about physics. Okay, when you come across, you take this amount of this chemical with this amount of this chemical, and you mix them together, and you heat them to this temperature, a chemical reaction takes place. It takes place all the time. Because of the fact it takes place all the time under certain conditions, we can therefore determine that this is a law. Something is happening here that's repeatable, right? Where did that law come from? How come that happens? And how come it happens all the time? And if it happens all the time and it's a law, where did the law come from? There had to be, this is just logic. If there's a law, there had to be a lawgiver.
Right.
Because laws just don't make themselves up. Laws don't evolve. Laws mean that there's been some super intelligence embedded in the nature and the fabric of the universe, which point you logically to a lawgiver, whom we call God. And that's why these folks don't like to go that way. They don't like to call these things laws, because laws always point to lawyers and lawgivers and law creators. And God forbid that there's a divine lawgiver who
demands accountability.
And then I'm in big trouble if I've broken any of the lawgiver's laws. And we all know that we have.
So this is interesting. I just had this thought. Okay, so 1 + 1 is almost always 2. I say that almost always for a reason, okay? 1 + 1 is so reliable to become 2 that we have built skyscrapers and space stations based on the foundation that 1 + 1 was 2.
The probabilities are so strong.
Yeah, that 1 + 1 is generally 2. In fact, the way that God reveals himself as God is coming to say, this 1 + 1 = 2? I'm going to break that law when I break the bread. And when you break the bread, I'm going to distort that law just to show you that I'm actually the Son of God, because that law is so powerful and so inherent in our nature.
It's just,
for Jesus to demonstrate who he is, he actually break that law as a demonstration of who he is. Because people always say, well, you Christians, you're just all about, you don't believe in the law because God, all these different things. We're like, no, we actually believe in this law, but we also believe in the creator who created the law, that he actually can break this law in certain times, most of the time not. But to demonstrate.
It's called miracles.
That's what miracles are. But he used that to demonstrate that he is the Son of God.
And that's why he has authority over the entire created world.
But all that's founded on the foundation that there is a lawmaker, and that 1 + 1 is 2 comes from God. That's why he has authority to break it. So Jesus came to break that law, not like he said, not to abolish the law, but actually to reveal that he's greater than the law.
Greater than the law. Yeah. Amen. Which leads me to the last, I guess, good summary of this. It says not only is nature lawful, but those laws can be stated in precise mathematical formulas.
It's crazy.
Now, you need to talk here because you're a math guy. I was embarrassed. My dad was a math teacher and had a math brain. He would, when we were checking out, at the grocery store, we'd have a grocery cart full of stuff for our family. Yeah. And my dad, while the checkout person was, running the scans, beep, 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 my dad was doing the math in his mind. He was like rounding up or whatever, but he was keeping a total going in his mind, and it was a game for him to see how close he could get to the actual thing. Now, after like $2.50, $1, I'm going like the Three Stooges, right? And I'm like, all right, my steam's coming out of my ears, smoke. But my dad would get pretty close.
Yeah,
he loved doing that. But I wanted to read a beautiful passage. This is another book we recommend. It's called The Soul of Science by Nancy Pearcey and Charles Thaxton. And it's a deeper dive scientifically even into the book we've been reading. But this was amazing. It was a story about Kepler, who was a famous astronomer and a devoted Christian. He says, a striking example can be found in the work of Kepler, who struggled for years with a slight difference of 8 minutes between observation and calculation of the orbit of the planet Mars. Eventually, this slight imprecision drove him to abandon the idea of circular orbits and to postulate elliptical orbits. If Kepler had not maintained the conviction that nature must be precise, he would not have agonized over those 8 minutes, or would not have broken through a traditional belief in circular orbits that had held sway for 2,000 years. Kepler spoke gratefully of those 8 minutes as a, quote, gift of God. Now,
Wow.
this is amazing. So he's looking at things and doing all the math and figuring things out, and there's 8 minutes difference, and that 8 minutes drove him to study and study and study and to basically overturn 2,000 years of acceptable thought on circular orbits, and that's why we understand now that the orbits are actually elliptical, because he said a God who is a God of rationality and order would not be 8 minutes off. So therefore, we'll have to find the 8 minutes.
Yeah.
That's the type of logic and precision and dogged persistence
Right.
that has created the scientific world in which
Right.
we live today, and simply would not have been there if we did not have these underlying Christian worldview beliefs.
It's absolutely amazing. I mean, you think about, pie, It goes
kind
on
of pie?
Yeah, apple pie. No.
Oh, I love apple pie.
The radius,
With ice
no,
cream
pie.
on it.
Yeah, no. The ratio, the circle is the circumference to the pi r square, whatever the ratio is. I don't even know what
Yes.
it is. But how I mean, it goes on infinitely, right? But that number, 22/7, that ratio is so precise to describe what a perfect circle looks like. Wow. I mean, just the precision of mathematics. Again, I thought I was pretty good at math until I went to college and took some math class. I'm like, I don't know what they're talking about. But the precision is what allows us to send people to the moon, to build skyscrapers. I mean, to do these crazy things. It's all about that crazy precision. And imagine everything's like kind of like, oh, whatever. Well, you build a skyscraper, it might fall, it might not. No, they have enough precision to know they can build these crazy things, like amazing things they're building, and just know that exactly this will stay. This will be able to handle this amount of wind.
So you got precision in the outer world, the natural world. You have precision on the inner world. Here's another great example of the human cell. Think about this. The amount of information contained in a single human cell equals the entire 30 volumes of the Encyclopedia Britannica several times over. So think of just a 30-volume set of encyclopedia several times over, stacked on in. That's how much data is contained in one cell in our body. Now, a person who's not blinded by their ideology, right, looks at that and says, where did that information come from? Right. They don't go, oh, that evolved over accidentally with mutations over gazillions of years, because that was the other thing that was found out. With all the mathematical precision that we have, it is an impossibility for us to get what we have today, given an infinite amount of time of random chance mutations to create, for instance, just the human body. It can't happen. It is a mathematical impossibility because of what we know about mathematics.
Sure.
So these are all the things that, again, where ideology blinds us to the truth. Let's just quickly, in the time that we have left, cover kind of a summary, and we'll hit on this quickly. So first of all, Christian teachings have served as presuppositions for science. We have the presupposition of a rational God and the laws of nature. So without the Bible, without the teaching of the Bible, we would not have the necessary worldview for science to emerge. Secondly, Christian teachings sanctioned science because they were a means of alleviating the toil and suffering that we find in the world. So, again, it was the Bible that led us to the fact that we were called to take dominion so that we could actually alleviate the pain, the suffering, and the toil that we see all around us. Well, why do we see that? Because the world has fallen, and the Bible teaches these things. Christian teaching supplied the motives for science, the motives being to display the glory of God and the wisdom of the Creator. So when a scientist of old came across a major discovery, they would worship. And I would tell our students, especially when I was discipling senior students, whenever you're in chemistry class and you are doing a scientific experiment and you're mixing chemicals and you get a chemical reaction and you stumble upon a law that's in your books, the whole class should stop at that moment, either fall on their faces or lift their hands above their head and worship and praise the Creator, because you've just discovered the wisdom of God. And the wisdom of God is the glory of God. It's part of His glory. And when we discover the glory of God, we should worship because we're creatures. And so our chemistry classes should be full of worship. And our medical universities and medical training should be full of worship, the glory of the Lord, because the human body is amazing. And our hard sciences should be full of worshipers. And yet, unfortunately, because we've rejected God, we keep on embracing laws and we keep on seeing the glory, but we don't give glory due to the Creator. Yeah. So I've always said, and you brought this point out, this might be a good comment to touch on a little bit of what you were highlighting beforehand. Sometimes we think that the only place where we should worship God is in church or in our missionary training. But you brought out a really good point. If we could recover the fact that the created realm is sacred and holy, and that, in mathematics or business or whatever, if we would go hard after the godly principles and doing things God's way for God's glory, we'd bust out of this like little Gnosticism bubble that we still embrace in the Western church today in evangelicalism.
Well, explain what that Gnostic
is. So the Gnostic bubble is that spiritual things are holy, and that physical things are lesser.
Yeah.
So if you pursue spiritual things like theology, then you have a high calling. But if you pursue mathematics, then that's a lesser calling. And what we're saying, and what this teaches is, no, wait a minute, mathematics has a certain degree of beauty and glory that points back to a God who's highly precise. And to use your mind to study mathematics for the glory of God is a holy thing. Yeah. Or to run a business for the glory of God, to alleviate pain and suffering, or to bring blessing to people, or to serve people, is a holy thing. And so there is no Gnostic bubble. We pop that bubble. All of the created realm is holy. So if you're a dirt mover, you're an excavator. I watch those guys with precision get our ground perfectly ready to house a parking lot and to create a building. I'm watching all these guys lifting steel that was fabricated in a plant thousands of miles away, and they're putting it on bolts that were put out of sand on concrete foundations, and those bolts are all perfectly lining up with the steel that was fabricated thousands of miles away, all because of engineering.
Right.
Thank God for engineering. I mean, we would not be in this building today if these hard sciences and the application of these things were not embraced as holy and as a virtuous call.
And that's the key, is some people are called to be missionaries. Go be a missionary. But I think the problem is when some people has been called to be a doctor, to be an engineer, to be a dirt mover, to study biology, and then you communicate to them and say, no, your calling is not as high as a pastor or a Bible study leader or whatever. Right. Whereas, no, God's the one who gives the call. Who are you to tell them their call is less than yours and try to persuade? When you say this field is all that is and that all that is holy and everyone needs to suck into that field, man, you are doing great danger, because you're tapping into that Gnostic idea that there's a spiritual and a secular. And what's happening in the world, in America today, is that due to the retreat, that's the teaching of the church in general, the retreat of Christians and biblical worldview from these secular marketplace realms, then you leave a vacuum of secularism, and you're wondering why they're coming down our necks and destroying our religious liberties.
We've lost the hard sciences. We've lost
education,
the legal profession.
This is one of the most important part of the book. I didn't realize science founded from university, but these universities all came from the churches. Yes. The Christians started this. Of all the founders of the scientific principle, like 60% were devout Christians. The other 40% were Christian. They just weren't considered devout Christians or something like that.
Yep.
And you realize, wow, that's our heritage. Because from the biblical, the literal reading, these are literalists of the Bible. They aren't some nominal Christian. The literalists of the Bible, they're the one who said, we need to recapture science, and they changed the Western civilization. And now, fast forward a couple thousand years later, we have the church that says, oh, science, that's just what the world does. That's the business, economic, that's just what the world does. You come and stay in the church, and let's pray so we can all go to heaven. Whereas they forgot our birthright to change the world.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well stated. And it always puts a passion in me. I guess that's why you and I both have a passion for higher education. it puts a passion in me to recover some of these things so that young people understand the why behind how we got here, the virtue in whatever you do it for the glory of God.
Yep.
Do it to serve people. Do it to help alleviate pain and suffering. Do it to take a job that's full of toil and hard work and create technologies, a heavy equipment that can do the work for you. Use your mind to serve the planet, But all these things make zero sense unless you get back to the roots and their foundation. Absolutely. And I like what you said, and we've talked about this, and I encourage some of you that are watching, if you're just watching here, go back a few episodes, because we talk about the fact that it was the church that provided the intellectual foundation for establishing the university, the uni, meaning coming from one worldview, university, and it was the university that gave rise to science. And so, again, if you don't go back to the church and the Bible, one thing I'll just say in closing here, the only conflict between science and Christianity was between church leaders and scientists, and much of that was not an argument over their science. It had theological, moral, political, social, personal issues, just like we have today.
Yeah.
Like, I could disagree with you, not because of what you're saying, but because I don't like you or because I find you as a threat.
Right.
Or because your idea makes us have to reestablish, it's disruptive. It makes us have to relook at things. But there has never been a conflict between Christianity and science. When the Bible is properly understood or science is properly understood, those two things never contradict.
I know we're going a little long, but even how he contracts the whole situation with Galileo, that was the example everyone says, the church is against science because they banned Galileo. At least they didn't burn him at the stakes like of Tyndale. I mean, that's the example they give. It's like they treated him actually pretty darn well, and the difference is mostly not science, but theological difference from Galileo, if you really study into that, right?
And we find out, Galileo had a personality, and he was a little bit
abrasive.
Brash,
and his exile or his house arrest was like some mansion, Yeah,
but the point being, we're all humans, and most conflict doesn't necessarily stem from ideological purity or whatever. There's a lot of other factors, and so anyway, this is just very, very helpful to understand. Bottom line, without Christianity, there is no science. Let's just say that again. Without Christianity, there is no science. And you cannot continue, as you said, to perpetuate a scientific community in the absence of Christianity.
You're going to sink back into superstition, bias, science, mysticism, which is what's happening right now in our world. The world's
or scientists trying to play God.
Scientism. That's why right now we are starting to sink back right into that.
Just like follow the science. Follow the science. And we found out how that worked for us when it's not rooted in the Christian worldview.
Yes, absolutely.
All right. Well, hey, we've had way too much fun with this today. I hope you've enjoyed the journey with us. We look forward to being with you next Thursday on the Ron Johnson Discipleship Podcast. Have a great week.